Welcome to this class on kernel methods. So in this kernel jungle, today we are going to discuss kernels that are derived from a probabilistic model. So why are this class of kernels important? Because they introduce a few principles that allows you to recycle a model for your data and use it within the kernel framework. For example, you may have a generative model for your data, which encodes lots of a priori knowledge about a specific problem. And then if you want to use it for a discriminative task, there are already techniques in the probabilistic world to do that. But here there are also natural tools to use kernels for that. So there is some motivation, which is also to get a kernel which is adaptive to the data that you have, because you know that when you want to design a kernel for a specific problem or for specific data, it's kind of an art. It's not always easy. I mean, there are a few kernels that work relatively well for generic data, such as the Gaussian kernel, but we know that there are plenty of other types of data for which it's not necessarily easy. But in the literature, you find lots of probabilistic models, I mean, that are encoding a priori knowledge about the data. And this question, how do we design a kernel adapted to the data, can be answered by kernel methods. So for that, let us introduce simply a small notation. So it's not very complicated. The notation we want to introduce is simply that when you have data that live in a set X, we consider a family of probability distributions that are parameterized by theta, which live in a subset of Rm. And this distribution is denoted by p theta. So this is what we call the parametric model. This is what we will call the probabilistic model. And among the different kernels that are able to exploit such probabilistic principles, one very famous one, which has been very successful, is the Fisher kernel. So you may have heard, I mean, if you were doing computer vision about 15 years ago, you would have heard about Fisher kernel because there were a natural way to embed natural images that was achieving state-of-the-art results for classification tasks, which was using, in fact, something called the Fisher vectors, which are derived from the Fisher kernel. So, okay, let us define formally what is the Fisher kernel. So the Fisher kernel starts from a probabilistic model, which is denoted by this notation p theta here. And typically, you are going to fit the parameters of your probabilistic model to the data. Typically, you are going to use maximum likelihood to do that over a training set of data points. So you fix your parameter theta, you call now this fixed parameter theta 0, which is assumed to fit well, I mean, which is assumed to be a good parameter for your data in the sense that you are simply fitting the data with your model. Now, a quantity which may be interesting, I mean, it's a quantity which is interesting beyond kernel methods simply because it has a nice interpretation. It's called the Fisher score vector, which is simply what? It's simply the gradient of the log probability p theta of x evaluated at theta 0. So given, it says here a sequence x, but let us forget it was probably because this slide was actually used in the context of sequence data, but let us consider simply a data point x. What is this Fisher vector? It's phi of x is simply the gradient of the log likelihood with respect to theta. So why is this quantity interesting? It's interesting because it encodes the contribution of each parameter to the model. So why is that? Imagine that you have, with respect to imagine that one entry of this vector is very small. If this is the case, it means that the corresponding parameter has a small derivative. I mean, the derivative of the log likelihood is small with respect to this parameter. It means that if you change the value of this parameter, it's not going to change much the log likelihood. Okay, so that means that in that sense, the contribution of this parameter is small. On the other hand, if you have a large entry in this Fisher vector here, it means that the corresponding parameter is going to influence a lot the log likelihood. So that's why you can interpret this as encoding contributions of parameters to the probabilistic model. So now we could say, well, we have an embedding, we can simply use that in other tasks. For example, in discriminative task, and you will be right, this is something that we will do in practice. Now, if you want to have a few better properties, and I will come back to that, you can define also a kernel based on this data embedding, which is here the Fisher score vector. So the classical embedding, which is called the Fisher kernel, is the following one. It's simply the Fisher vector times the inverse of a matrix, which is called I of theta 0. I will explain what this is, times the Fisher vector. So it's almost the inner product between the two Fisher vectors, one evaluated for x, one evaluated for x prime. But you have here this matrix that changes the metric. And this matrix is called the Fisher information matrix. So we take the inverse of it here. It's simply the expectation of the Fisher vector times the Fisher vector transpose, where the expectation is computed on the training data. Okay, the part which is random is simply the distribution, sorry, not the training data, but it's simply the data, the expectation is according to the data distribution. Not simply one thing is that when theta 0 is obtained by maximum likelihood, then it turns out that it means that the expectation of your Fisher score is equal to 0, because simply what you do when you compute maximum likelihood is that you are optimizing the log likelihood. So since the Fisher vector is looking at the gradient of the log likelihood, then when you take the expectation, you get 0. So that also means then that the interpretation of the Fisher information matrix is that just the covariance matrix of the Fisher score. So this is not that important, but what is important is that by using this sort of, we can call it a sort of normalization, we will get a nice invariance property that I'm going to discuss next. So about the Fisher kernel properties, like I said, the Fisher score describes how each parameter contributes to the process of generating a particular example, so how much it contributes to the probabilistic model. Then there is something to say. I don't want to insist on this now because we will come back to that later. But you know, when you have a generative model of your data, it's very simple to derive some classification rules, you know, by using Bayes rules. It leads, for example, to a procedure called maximum a posteriori labeling, which is based on a model. And it's possible to show that if instead you use the Fisher kernel, you are doing something a bit more clever. And I will explain what I mean by that later. So basically, the map labeling will be a particular case of classifier that is derived from the Fisher kernel, except that you can do better if you optimize your model using the Fisher kernel. There are also the variants of the Fisher kernel in the literature. You can look at this paper if you like. It's already a bit old, and there are probably plenty of new other variants that are more recent about the Fisher kernel. But it's not really the goal of this lecture to discuss that. So feel free to look at this paper if you like. Now let us look at an important property of the Fisher kernel. There is something very nice about it, which is that it's invariant under a change of parametrization. And this is nice because, you know, if you have a probabilistic model and you derive a kernel from it, if you make a change of variable, you obtain a different probabilistic model, but it would not be a nice property to have a different kernel. And it turns out that the Fisher kernel is invariant by reparametrizing your probabilistic model. So this is nice. So if you want to be a bit more formal, we can easily check this by considering a change of variable, which is obtained by some diffeomorphism. So simply because we want to get some differentiability properties. So let us consider that the initial parameters are theta, but you have a function f that replaces theta by a new parameter lambda. Okay. So when you have a diffeomorphism, there is a natural quantity that you may consider, which is the Jacobian matrix that relates the parametrization between lambda and theta. So let us simply define it by this matrix J. If we look now at the Fisher score with respect to lambda, so assuming that theta 0 has been fixed, then we can compute lambda 0 by the change of variable. Let us simply look at what is the relation between the Fisher score with respect to lambda and the Fisher score with respect to theta. So it's very easy to do. We do the chain rule. We use the definition of the Fisher score. We do the chain rule. And what we get is simply that we get the Jacobian matrix times the Fisher score with respect to theta 0. So that already shows that the Fisher score is not invariant by this parametrization because we have here this Jacobian matrix. Now, if we look at the Fisher information matrix, and this is why you will see that this Fisher information matrix gives some, it kind of justifies the use of this Fisher information matrix. If we look at it and we simply look at the definition, which is the expectation of phi lambda 0 of x times phi lambda 0 of x transpose. By using the previous relation between phi lambda 0 and phi theta 0, we get that the Fisher information matrix with respect to lambda 0 is simply the Fisher information matrix with respect to theta 0 times the Jacobian matrix on the left and the transpose of the Jacobian matrix on the right. Because we use a diffeomorphism, we can also invert this Jacobian matrix. And when we compute the inverse of the Fisher information matrix with respect to lambda 0, we get simply the inverse of the Fisher matrix with respect to theta 0 times the inverse of the Jacobian matrix on the right and on the left. And now it's easy to conclude that the kernel, the Fisher kernel, k of x prime, is invariant with respect to the parametrization. If we compute it with respect to theta 0, we get the same as when you compute it with lambda 0. And it's kind of a nice justification that the kernel, the Fisher kernel, is a natural way to encode distances with respect to a probabilistic model because it uses exactly the Fisher scores that have this nice interpretation in terms of contributions of each parameter with respect to the probabilistic model. But in addition to that, it is also invariant with respect to the parametrization. So that's one of the main property of the Fisher kernel. In practice, what do we do? In practice, we first fit the probabilistic model using using the probabilistic tools that you prefer. Basically, it will be often maximum likelihood, like I said before. So the Fisher score is estimated from data. So in some sense, it is adaptive to the data that you get because you fit the model to the data that you have. Something which is not very nice, because I explained that it's very important to be invariant with respect to the parametrization. But when we look at the literature in computer vision, for example, from 15 years ago, people were often assuming that, they were often replacing in practice the Fisher information matrix by the identity. So in that case, it will simply correspond to using the Fisher score as a data embedding. But it doesn't mean that all of the work that are using Fisher kernel were doing that. It's simply a few lines of work in computer vision which were using a particular parametrization that was working fine, that was working well, and there was no need for this specific work to be invariant to the parametrization. There are also ways, and I don't want again to detail that in this lecture, there are also ways to combine different parameters theta 0 instead, because saying that on a specific data set, I'm going to fit theta 0 using maximum likelihood is a bit arbitrary. You may have different subsets of data giving different estimators. You may have different ways of fitting theta 0. There are techniques to combine these different estimators. So at the end, well, the Fisher vectors, well, I was a bit confusing in the terminology I used because I should have said before Fisher score vectors that were the phi theta 0 of x without the Fisher information matrix. But what we formally should call Fisher vectors are simply the explicit embedding of the Fisher kernel, meaning the vectors such that k of x prime is an inner product between this small phi theta 0 of x and phi theta 0 of x prime. So given the definition of the Fisher kernel, it's easy to see that you obtain this by computing the inverse square root of the Fisher information matrix, and you multiply it on the right by the Fisher score vector, which is this big phi of theta 0 of x. Okay, and we have an explicit embedding, which is invariant by the parametrization. So now let us be a bit more concrete, because I try to give some intuition about what the Fisher score was encoding in terms of contribution of a parameter to the probabilistic model. So let us do it explicitly with the simplest case, which will be a Gaussian distribution with one dimension only. So this Gaussian distribution is parameterized by mu and sigma squared, mu being the mean and sigma squared the variance. And it turns out that since we know that we are invariant by a reparametrization, we are going simply to consider, instead of sigma squared, something which is called a precision parameter, which is 1 over sigma squared, and we call it alpha. And why we do that? Simply because the computation will be easier. So then what are the model parameters? They are mu and alpha. So this gives us this theta, this set theta of parameters. And it's easy to compute the log probability of a new data point x, which is simply this formula, which is given by 1/2 of the log of alpha minus a constant term minus 1/2 of alpha times x minus mu squared. So after we do that, we can simply compute the derivative of this with respect to mu, and we get alpha times x minus mu. We can also compute the derivative with respect to alpha, so we get 1/2 of 1 over alpha minus x minus mu squared. And as an exercise, given this, you can simply compute the Fisher information matrix and observe that in that particular case, this is a diagonal matrix with two coefficients, alpha and 1/2 of 1 over alpha squared. So you can simply, it's a simple exercise. You simply look at the definition of the Fisher matrix. You look at the computation of the derivatives that we have computed here, and you obtain this. Then we have everything we can also compute easily the inverse square root of this matrix. And at the end, it allows us to derive the Fisher vector, which is simply given by these two entries, x minus mu divided by sigma, and which is in fact nothing else than the deviation of x, with respect to mu, and we see that it's normalized by the variance. And the second term is simply a deviation of x minus mu squared divided by sigma squared, the difference with respect to 1. So it's actually easier to interpret if we consider a model which is a bit more complicated, because the Fisher vector, in fact, it's actually more useful to encode a set of points instead of encoding a single point. So why is that? If you assume that you have a set of points that are drawn ID from a specific probability distribution, you can also compute the probability of this set of points if you assume that they are ID, simply because the probability of obtaining x1 to xn is simply the product of the probabilities of obtaining each of the individual data points. So here we are going to consider again the case of the normal distribution. But when we do that, well, it's easy also to observe that because we have a product here, and because the Fisher kernel is considering the log probability, the product becomes a sum, and the Fisher vector is simply the sum of Fisher vectors of the individual points. So far, it doesn't look very complicated, but it gives us a nice intuition about what is, in fact, the Fisher vector of a set of points, what it encodes in practice. if you use a Gaussian distribution. So now phi of x1 to xn, where these are simply data points that are drawn according to some Gaussian distribution. Like we said, it's simply a sum of the phi of xi that we have computed in the slide before. So let us look again at the slide. The slide was using these formulas here. If we simply sum this for a set of n points, we get n times some quantities. And these quantities are interesting because the first entry is nothing else than mu hat minus mu divided by sigma. And mu hat is the empirical mean of the data point. So basically, the first entry of the Fisher vector up to a factor n is simply encoding the discrepancy between the empirical first order moment of the data with respect to the parameter mu of the model. And if we look now at the second term, so it was a bit hard to interpret in the previous slide, but when we sum over n points, it's become easy to interpret. It's simply sigma squared minus sigma hat squared normalized by sigma squared. So it's also a measure of discrepancy between the empirical variance here and the variance encoded in the probabilistic model. So now, why is it a quantity which is interesting for, let's say, for other tasks? Why is it an embedding which may be useful? It's maybe useful because when you consider a set of points, and let's say you want to classify your set, if you have several sets, let's say you have a set A and a set B that are drawn also according to this Gaussian distribution, basically the part that makes the set A and the set B different is not the first order moment mu of the Gaussian distribution because they share this first order moment. It's actually simply the way they differ from the original model. So that's why if you have some discriminative task, it's a quantity, the Fisher vector, which may be useful. So I must admit that here we are dealing with simply a Gaussian distribution in 1D, doing classification from data points that are drawn from some Gaussian distribution in 1D. It's not something which is very interesting. It's going to be interesting if we consider more flexible models. And I'm going to derive the Fisher vectors for this model, which is called a Gaussian mixture model. But before that, I want to do a bit of history. It's now part of history because, you know, it's not, it's the, let's say, history of state-of-the-art methods in computer vision. So back, you know, back in 2000, let's say 2011, before the ImageNet challenge in 2012, it was very popular in computer vision to describe an image as a collection of local features. And these local features were simply an embedding, a representation of local patches. So they were called visual words. So you may have heard about SIFT, HOG, lots of other types of features. I added here convolutional features just to be simply to be a bit more fashionable and to relate these old representations to more recent ones. But then after if you have representations of local features in an image and you see your image as a set of features, you need a representation of this set. In modern terms, it's both old terms and modern terms. We need a pooling operation. And it turns out that if your representation of your local features were derived from a probabilistic model, it's become very natural to use Fisher vector. And that was actually the case. Typically, we had representations called SIFT that were then encoding using a Gaussian mixture model, something that would simply be a generative model of the data. And then given a specific image that is represented by these local features x1 to xn, we would represent this set of features as the sum of this phi of xi, and phi of xi being, in fact, the Fisher vector. So here, this slide is more generic. I have not introduced Fisher vector for this specific example. It's simply coding stage of features, phi of xi, pooling, some pooling to represent the set. And Fisher vector with a Gaussian mixture model turned out to be extremely effective. And to be more precise, in 2011, they won the ImageNet challenge by using this technique. And then it was outperformed in 2012 by convolutional neural networks. It doesn't mean that these types of techniques are useless. It may simply mean that they were still missing a few nice properties of convolutional neural networks to achieve better results. And it's probably likely that at some point, these types of techniques will be used again in a different context, probably in a more effective context. That's why it's still good to know about these types of techniques. Okay, so let us be a bit more serious. Let us leave the world of a single Gaussian in 1D. Let us consider a GMM, a Gaussian mixture model with k Gaussian components, with parameters mu j, pi j. Pi j is simply the weight of every component in your probabilistic model. And you have sigma j, which is a covariance matrix. For simplicity, at least in computer vision, because the dimensions were pretty large, the covariance matrices were often modeled as diagonal matrices. And the probabilistic model is the following one, and it's much more flexible than simply, it's much more flexible than the simple Gaussian distribution. So it's actually a pretty rich model. And in the first stage, what you do is that you are going to extract your visual world. If you are dealing with computer vision, you are going to fit your Gaussian mixture model on this set of visual worlds that come from many different images. And after that, you are going to encode using the Fisher vector a new image. And the Fisher vector will simply represent the discrepancy that you have between the basically the empirical moments that you have in your image with respect to the one of the probabilistic model that has been fitted to many types of images. Let us be more precise. After some calculation that I don't want to do on the slide because it's just too painful, but you can trust me because you will see that the formulas are very similar to the ones that we had for the Gaussian distribution. And here, this is a mixture of Gaussians. We obtain a Fisher vector, which is equal to phi theta of x1 to xn. It contains many components. It contains components corresponding to the parameters pi1 to pi p. Well, do I have p components? No, it was, sorry, there is a small typo. I have, in fact, k components, but here I'm using p. Okay, so each time you see p, you should replace it in your head by k. We have also a set of entries that corresponds to the mean parameters of the Gaussian components, and also a part which corresponds to the sigma parameters of the components. And then the formula to simply encode that for a set of data points x, let's say a set of visual worlds. If we look at the part phi mu j, it's simply an average rescaled by pi j, which is the weight of the component j, that is a weighted sum of the discrepancies between the xi and the mu j. So now what are these rescaled by sigma j? So what are these weights, gamma ij? These weights, gamma ij, have a very important interpretation. The formula is given on the bottom. So I represents an element of the set X, let's say a word I. J corresponds to a component of the mixture Gaussian model. And the interpretation is a soft assignment of the word I to the component. Because when we look at this, if xi is very far from the mean mu j, this quantity here is going to be small. And here it's normalized such that these weights sum to 1 if we sum over the components. So it's really a soft assignment. Given the word I, we are going to compute this assignment, an assignment vector, some weights that sum to 1, that simply associate the word I to components. So it doesn't have to be binary. It's simply, you can have a weight, which is a word which is assigned to part of a Gaussian and part of another Gaussian. But then at the end, we get this quantity that looks like what we had before for the Gaussian distribution, which is still encoding a discrepancy between a weighted average of weights assigned, the part that is assigned to a specific Gaussian component. We encode the discrepancy with respect to mu j, which is simply the mean of this component. So again, this is encoding the discrepancy between empirical first order moments and the ones from the probabilistic model that has been fitted. And we have something similar for the second order moments, which are given by this formula. The interpretation is similar. Okay, so if I want to use a bit more compact notations, this is exactly what I was mentioning. The part phi mu j of x is simply encoding exactly some empirical average mu hat j. We compare it with mu j, and we do the same for the second order moments. And this empirical average are weighted. Basically, it should be seen, mu hat j, as the empirical average of points xi that have been assigned to the component j. So the resulting representation can be pretty large, by the way, because if the vectors xi are of dimension p, now p is indeed used in the right way here. This is the dimension of the input vector xi. Remember that the Fisher vector contains such quantities for every component of the mixture model. So that means that we have two vectors times k components, and each of these vectors is of the same size as the xi. So that means the final representation is of dimension 2 times k times p. Plus, I should also add the component phi pi of x, so pi being the weights of the individual components, but it turns out that at least in computer vision, it was observed that you could drop it. So the total dimensions was 2 times k times p. This may be large because if you have, let's say, if p is equal to 2000, okay, it's actually a reasonable size. If you have 100 of components in your mixture model, which is actually not a large quantity for these types of tasks, because if you want to model the set of visual patches, in computer vision, it's a set which is pretty rich, and you need many components to have a good model. So let's say that you still manage to do something good with 100 components. It means that the dimension here for encoding the set X is 200,000. And this is large because remember that in computer vision, we are going to encode an image. We are going to see an image as a set of visual words. So it means every image is going to be encoded by a vector of dimension 200,000. And typically, this leads to things that are pretty challenging in terms of memory. And that was one of the main limitations of this approach. Now, of course, we may also have things that are more clever and have representations of the xi that are smaller dimensional, and these types of things may start to be possible to, it may be then possible to use it even if you have lots of data. Okay, that's something, that's also an old slide. I should also update it, but I want to say that Fisher vectors, what I have presented here was state-of-the-art for image representations before the revival of ConvNet in 2012. They were winning the ImageNet challenge. I must also notice that this is a representation which is unsupervised, which is very high dimensional, but it is unsupervised. And when I did this slide a few years ago, it turns out that it was actually achieving state-of-the-art results for classification tasks when the input images were unsupervised. Because when you look at the ImageNet challenge, this is here an accuracy measure. the original model was achieving something like 55% accuracy, and at least, let's say, 3 or 4 years ago, or even 2 years ago, the state of the art for deep neural networks with unsupervised representations were like plateauing at 40%. Now this has changed, but this is not the topic of this class. This has changed with methods that are called self-supervised methods that are achieving something like 70 or more than 70%. So I must not say that, so we should not say that deep neural networks, unsupervised deep neural networks are outperformed today by Fisher vectors, but it was still the case about 2 years ago. It's still pretty impressive because, you know, it means that after 2012, for at least 5, 6, or 7 years, people did not manage to outperform Fisher vectors using deep nets if the image representation was unsupervised. Now, like I said, this has changed with recent approaches called self-supervised methods. A last remark that I want to make about the Fisher kernel. There are a few computations that you will have to do at home yourself. So you will have to trust me when I give you some of the results. But I mentioned at some point that using the Fisher kernel, you will do at least as well as a basic map labeling. What does it mean? It means that if you have a generative probabilistic model, a joint model of data X and labels Y, it's easy to derive a probabilistic rule by using Bayes' rule, simply because assume, let us discuss this assumption later, but simply, if you have such a probabilistic model, p theta of xy, you can simply classify by using this assignment rule that simply look at the maximum, given a new data point x, you're going to look at the maximal probability p theta of y equal k given x. You're going to look at every possible labels. And to compute this quantity, we can simply apply Bayes rules, which is here. You can also extend this marginal distribution using these quantities. And it turns out that this is going to be useful for us to relate the Bayes rule with Fisher kernels. Not the Bayes rules, this basic classification procedure with Fisher kernels. And we are going to see that, in fact, Fisher kernels can do things that are a bit more clever. It's not very precise what I'm saying here, but it's going to be clear in the next slide. So for that, we need to make a few assumptions. So what are the assumptions? We make simply the assumption that the marginals, pi k, which is simply the a priori that you have specific labels without looking at the data x, are among the parameters theta that we fit to our model. And we are going also to make things actually to simplify some computation. We are going also to assume that this pi k, which represent simply the entries of a vector that sums to 1, can be also parameterized by some quantities alpha k. So this is simply a change of variable, which is pretty basic. So then we need to, since we want to make to relate this map labeling to the Fisher score, let us compute indeed the Fisher score, which is the gradient of the log p theta of x. Here we are going to do a few steps that are not very interesting, but that will simply help us to achieve to obtain some conclusions. So it's not very interesting. You can look at this at home. What is important for us to notice is that after a few tricks, after a few additional computations, when we look at the derivative of the log p theta of x with respect to alpha k, we get p theta of y equal k given x minus pi k. Pi k, remember, it's simply the probability of y equal k. And after saying that, when we look at the first p elements of the Fisher score, so we assume that these are the elements that carries these derivatives here. Well, it contains simply the p theta of y equal a label given x minus pi of this label. And if you assume that you are going to learn a linear classifier using this Fisher score, what does it mean? It means that you are going to consider the following procedure. Y hat of x, so the way you classify x, the way you assign a label is simply the argmax of phi theta of x times a specific vector wk that I'm going to introduce plus an intercept bk. So this is simply a multi-class linear classifier. It turns out that there exists a vector wk and an intercept bk that gives you exactly the map labeling from before, which is simply maximizing the label given x by using the Bayes rules, as we did in the previous slides. So how can we do that? We simply look at the formula given by the Fisher score. We consider simply an intercept bk to be pi k. We consider a vector wk that has a weight equal to 1 at the k position and 0 otherwise, and we get exactly this relation. So what does it mean? It means that if you use the Fisher kernel, because even if you have the inverse square root of the Fisher information matrix, what I'm seeing here is still true, you can use the Fisher kernel, and among the classifiers that are using the kernel embedding, there is one which implements simply Bayes rule. And then, of course, if now you are trying to optimize this classifier using the kernel embedding using data, you are going to do something that is more clever. I think I can simply give you the intuition by this slide. So that's all I wanted to say about the Fisher kernel. Remember, it's adaptive to the data. It's a way to turn a probabilistic model into a kernel. And when you want to use it for a classification task, you know that you can do at least as well as using Bayes rule if you were simply using your original probabilistic model. Okay. And also the other message is that it's a very natural way as well if you're using a Gaussian mixture model to aggregate, in other words, to do a pooling operations in a set of vectors. So that's basically, you can also see it this way. It's a way to do pooling. It's a way to turn a probabilistic model into a kernel such that you can do many things with it. And it can also implement Bayes rule. So it has many nice properties. So let us say a few words, very few words about another types of kernels that exist. They are not as popular as Fisher kernel, but let us look at them. If you have a probabilistic model P theta, and you can write this sort of expectations, meaning you have a measurable set and so on, you can use a prior W of d theta. You can form a kernel by simply integrating P theta of x times P theta of x prime. In other words, a way to turn a probabilistic model into a kernel is simply to define an inner product in terms of L2 here between our probability distributions. That's what is said here. So here, there is no explicit computation of any finite dimensional feature vector like in the Fisher kernel, if you can have a closed form solution for this sort of thing, for this sort of formulas. I can give you one example. Example coin toss. Okay, Bernoulli distribution, you have P theta of x equal 1 is equal to theta, P theta of x equal to 0 is equal to 1 minus theta. This is a model for random coin toss with the theta parameters between 0 and 1. If we simply consider the Lebesgue measure on 0, 1, you can simply run this probabilistic model. For the first set, you get, let's say, 0, 0, 1. For the other set, you get 1, 0, 1, 0. It gives you immediately this probability P theta of x and P theta of x prime. And then you can simply compute your integral, and you get a quantity that is a measure of similarity between x and x prime according to the probabilistic model. Okay, so that's also a way to turn probabilistic model into a kernel. So here it's obvious that the kernel is positive definite. And let us look at another one, which is also interesting because there were also nice applications for probabilistic models. Sorry, for biological sequence modeling. So this is a kernel that is useful when you have observed the data and we have latent variables that are associated to some conditional probability distribution. So assume that you have a kernel for the complete data. So if you have X observed data, Y latent variable, if you have a good way to measure the similarity between the set XY and another set X prime, Z prime, this kernel is called KZ of ZZ prime in that case. Well, you can simply, assuming that all of these quantities make sense and you are allowed to compute these expectations, you can simply compute the expectation of the kernel with respect to the latent variables. So in some way, you marginalize with respect to the latent variables. If you have a model and a kernel that allows you to do this efficiently, then you get also a kernel to compare X and X prime. Okay, so that's let us give the intuition about why this makes sense and why we get a positive definite kernel. Well, we first consider the kernel embedding of the kernel KZ, and then we compute the expectations. We do things here that would need to be justified, but anyway, because of the linearity of the expectations, what we get at the end is an explicit embedding for your new kernel, which is simply the expectation of the embeddings of the marginalization of the embeddings of the complete data X and Y when we draw the expectation with respect to Y. Of course, for these quantities to make sense, we will need to make a few assumptions, but here I just want to give the idea, which is not perfectly rigorous on this slide. And if you have a look at the class on biological sequences, I had actually stopped at the part that we are discussing the application of probabilistic models to biological sequences. I think this part is interesting, so I'm going to jump here and say very few words. I'm not going to give all of the details. I just want to give you the flavor about these types of applications, simply and give you a few pointers to the literature. So basically, when you have biological sequences, it turns out that hidden Markov models are very popular. And it's actually possible, so let us actually skip this part. It's actually possible to use a marginalized model using hidden Markov models, okay, where the latent variables you are going to marginalize with respect to them. This is the example again of the coin toss. So it's a very basic example, where we have a coin which is actually we have two coins. One is normal, the other one is biased. And at every step, we are going to draw one of the coin, but there is a latent variable, which is normal or bias. And you can do the marginalized kernel with respect to that. So I don't want to do the computation on this slide. Feel free to look at them at home. But everything we explained about the marginalized kernels, you can do that explicitly here. And you will get the nice applications, basically, of the marginalized kernel for biological sequences. It requires, in fact, to have some knowledge about HMM, some knowledge about how to compute efficiently probabilities using an HMM, using dynamic programming. So it's an interesting part which has nice applications. And I will basically stop here the class on kernel methods for